Today is the Minister for Foreign Affairs from Indonesia, Mr. Ali Alatas. Mr. Alatas, I see from his CV, reveals that he had beginnings in the press. According to this, he was a proofreader of a daily newspaper, and then in a meteoric rise he became editor of the local wire service. He tells me that this is while he was a student, and it doesn't really represent his career at all in the press. He did, however, after entering Foreign Affairs, retain some links with the press. In the early part, he became Director of Information and Cultural Relations in the Department of Foreign Affairs. Also, in those early days, he was counsellor in Washington in the Indonesian Embassy, before rising, of course, through the ranks to be finally Executive Secretary to the head of the Secretariat. And after that, the permanent representative to the UN, and he became Minister for Foreign Affairs last year. Would you welcome Ali Alatas?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Barton, for your kind words of introduction. It was rather meteoric from proofreader to editor. But it was not because I bribed the chief editor. I went to another organization. Mr. President, distinguished members and guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm genuinely pleased and honored to have this opportunity to be with you today and to share with you some thoughts on Indonesian-Australian relations. This National Press Club has over the years established quite a reputation for itself as a lively forum with an active interest not only in national affairs but in both regional and international affairs. And it's always a pleasure to address an audience as engaged on the issues as I know you are. On a recent visit to Indonesia in October last year, my esteemed colleague and good friend, Senator Evans, expressed the view that it was high time for us, meaning Indonesia and Australia, to stop fussing about the Australian-Indonesian relationship as if it were a patient of precarious health, constantly needing the worried attention of diplomatic doctors. Instead, he urged us to get on with the task of building it into a robust and self-sustaining relationship. I fully share his views. I too believe that common interest requires us now to look to the future and to give even more solid and diverse substance to our bilateral relationship. In so doing, the differences between us and the occasional difficulties in that relationship, which between neighbors will inevitably crop up from time to time, will hopefully no longer loom so disproportionately as to overshadow everything else. Of course, there are differences, very basic differences between our two countries and our two societies. Differences sourced in history, in culture, tradition, and in socio-political systems. It is only to be expected that an Asian developing non-aligned country with a democracy based on Pancasila, Indonesia would perceive and address its problems, its priorities, its national purposes in a different way from Australia, a prosperous, developed country and a society of European origin with an established tradition and outlook based on a Westminster type of democracy. So our two nations do have their own distinctive identities, do have differences, and by all means, vive la différence. But in acknowledging these differences, let us equally appreciate the commonalities between us and the wide range of common interests that we share. Beyond the immutable geopolitical fact that our two countries are next door neighbors, I believe we do have common interest in harmony and mutual benefit in our bilateral relationship, in peace and stability regionally, and in greater participatory equality and equity on such vital international issues as disarmament, development, international security. Therefore, a clear and common interest in developing close and mutually beneficial cooperation in the pursuit of these goals. And it is indeed gratifying to note that, especially in the regional and international spheres, we have since quite some time already established such cooperation, both bilaterally and in the framework of the respective sub-regional groupings to which we belong, the ASEAN and the South Pacific Forum. We do see eye to eye on the overriding need to foster peace, stability, and generalized prosperity in the immediate region around us, East Asia and the South Pacific, without which our own stability and security, as well as our national development objectives, could be adversely affected. In this respect, Australia's stands support to Indonesia and ASEAN in the search for a comprehensive, just, and durable solution to protracted strife and conflict in Kampuchea is deeply appreciated. So are Australia's concrete contributions to the various cooperative programs and projects between the ASEAN countries and its industrialized dialogue partners within the so-called ASEAN PMC. And in the more general context of promoting regional security and stability, our identity of interest is also evidenced by the mutual support we have extended to one another, both individually and again through ASEAN and the South Pacific Forum, on such issues as the banning of nuclear tests and the establishment of a nuclear-free zone in the South Pacific, the prospective establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone as an integral component of ZOPFAN in Southeast Asia, self-determination and independence for New Caledonia, the extension of technical cooperation to the South Pacific island countries, inter alia through what is called the ASEAN-Pacific Cooperation in Human Resources Development. It may be redundant, but it bears reiterating that in seeking to safeguard its own security and to contribute to regional peace and stability, Indonesia will steadfastly abide by and rely on its own concept of national and regional resilience rather than on military alliances or the build-up and projection of military power. In the international arena, I'm also pleased to observe the close cooperation that has evolved between us in such areas as multilateral disarmament, decolonization, international trade liberalization, commodity negotiations, both within the GATT and UNCTAD. Lately, a new climate of conciliation and mutual accommodation has taken hold throughout the world, and especially among the major powers. In many regions, armed conflict and confrontation are giving way to dialogue and negotiation. Concurrently, some basic trends are asserting themselves on the international economic scene, resulting in the progressive integration of the world economy, the emergence of powerful economic blocs among developed countries, but also at the same time, in increasing marginalization of large segments of the developing economies. So while a welcome brightening can be discerned in the global East-West relationship, it would appear to us that, on the contrary, the inequities and disparities in the North-South context have remained as stark as ever, and may even aggravate. We in Indonesia therefore believe that the reactivation of the global North-South dialogue has therefore become an urgent necessity. But this time around, such a dialogue should not be cast as an exercise in either supplication or self-righteous demand on the part of the poor, nor as misperceived charity on the part of the rich, as it was before. Rather, it should be based on the imperative of genuine interdependence and on the mutuality of interest among all nations of the world in securing a more viable, a more equitable, a more open international monetary and trading system. And in this endeavor too, we look forward to continue cooperating with you as constructively as we have done before. Indonesia and Australia and the ASEAN and the South Pacific Forum are important components of a wider region, the Pacific Basin. As we all know, this is a region embracing more than half of the world's population and encompassing the major powers as well as the most dynamic and fastest growing economies. We all know and we have all read about its richness in cultural diversity, in human, natural, technological resources. We have all read about the predictions that the center of gravity of world economic activity may soon shift to the Pacific, bypassing the Atlantic, and that may usher in a new Pacific century. Yet, on the other hand, one cannot underestimate the real impediments and constraints inherent in efforts to transform that vision into reality. There are severe economic disparities. There is continuing political contention and conflict prevailing in this vast region. And this could well engender heightened competition, friction, and even confrontation instead of desired harmony and enlarged cooperation if not handled well. What is clear, however, is that in meeting the challenges as well as the opportunities implicit in the emergent Pacific era, there will be even greater potential and need for our two countries to cooperate and to consult with one another so as to enable us to contribute to the building of a Pacific region of real peace, greater and more harmonious cooperation, and equitable, just progress for all. Now, as for Indonesia and ASEAN, we have not only been quite appreciative of the bright prospects of wider Pacific economic cooperation, but within the ASEAN machinery, we have already begun to develop concrete programs and practices in anticipation of its eventual materialization. ASEAN's annual exchanges of views with its Pacific dialogue partners, the institution of the APCHRD program, to which I referred to earlier, exemplify this approach. In the non-governmental sphere, Indonesia has from this outset supported the so-called Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, the PECC, as a valuable informal forum for mutual consultation, dialogue, and inquiry on the concrete possibilities of intra-Pacific cooperation. Having succeeded, however modestly still, in bringing about greater political stability and common economic progress in their own sub-region through ways and means that have proven their efficacy, ASEAN countries are understandably keen to ensure that the prospective modalities of cooperation in the wider context of the Pacific are similarly directed towards real mutual benefit, equity, and equal opportunity. So, being sensitive of this essential requirement and aware of the prevailing obstacles and constraints, as earlier mentioned, Indonesia and the ASEAN have reacted with caution and some measure of reservation to proposals to move too quickly towards the establishment of more formal structures of Pan-Pacific economic cooperation. Mr. President, distinguished members and guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me now turn to some areas of our bilateral relationship. Let me begin by observing that while overall government-to-government and people-to-people relations have been, from the outset, quite close and cordial, there have been occasional stresses and strains over the past years caused by incidents and factors that are in fact external or should at least be marginal to these two broad spheres of interaction between our two nations. Conventional wisdom has it that the incidents that have often marked our bilateral relations, as inter alia exemplified by a persistently negative coverage of Indonesia by some sections of the Australian media, the habitually anti-Indonesia stance of certain Australian NGOs, and Indonesia's strong reactions against them are fundamentally sourced in the differences in socio-cultural values, political systems, and traditions between us. Generally speaking, this is certainly true. But I sometimes wonder whether we can or should accept this as being the only comprehensive explanation of the state of affairs. As I earlier noted, there are basic differences between our two countries and peoples, culturally, socially, and politically. But I submit this is not unique to Indonesian-Australian relations. It does not apply to Indonesian-Australian relations only. Indonesia, and so does Australia, has relations with scores of other nations where the same cultural gaps apply. Yet, no similar brittleness in the relationship is to be found in those relationships as they pertain to our relationship. So maybe we should look also for other causes, apart from the underlying cultural dichotomy that is fully acknowledged. Fully acknowledged. I do not pretend to know the definitive answer or answers to this question. Is it because of proximity that tends to sharpen sensitivities? Is there a built-in bias? And if so, why? Maybe we should together search for the answers. But I think, whatever the case may be, it would seem to me that apart from the obvious long-term need to enhance better mutual understanding and appreciation of our cultural differences, there is, in the shorter term, clearly also the need to free ourselves from prejudices and preconceived notions of each other, to consciously develop at least greater tolerance and sensitivity towards each other's differences, towards each other's aspirations, towards each other's cultural values, to consciously develop a greater sense of proportionality in viewing and approaching and in reporting our respective conditions. I think above all, there must now also be greater awareness and determination on the part of government and on the part of our society, which, as I said at the beginning of my talk, is full of goodwill towards one another, not to allow, perhaps, the preconceived or biased views of a small group, how focal it may be, to negatively affect the perceptions or feelings of the majority. To paraphrase an Indonesian proverb, let us not allow that one drop of vinegar spoil the entire bowl of milk. I believe that we in Indonesia do understand, or at least do try to understand, the workings of Western-type democracy. Most of us have had a Western education. Most of us have been exposed to Western culture, literature. I believe we in Indonesia do understand and appreciate the concept of freedom of the press, as practiced in Australia and in other Western-type democracies. I think we know what human rights mean. We know how its history is in the Western legal culture and in the Western legal and philosophical culture. Freedom of the press, we do believe in it. But I also believe that, I hope you would agree with me, that equal freedom for all, because we want all to have the same freedom, cannot be obtained without a commensurate measure of responsibility and restraint. That is what we ask. Not to overturn the very important principle of press freedom. And I think you will agree with me that freedom of the press should never mean, nor was it ever conceived to be, a license to defame. So the fervent hope I would like to convey to you today is, let us set aside unfounded and unnecessary suspicion, prejudice between us. Let us try to look forward, not backward. Let us stop, for example, desperately keeping alive a non-issue built around a non-existent cause, which is the so-called East Timor question. So I come back to the theme on which I started my talk, which is that in the face of so many common interests and such fundamental and important shifts in the world around us, in the regional environment, we should try to build substance to our relationship. We should together try to remove the stresses and strains that are between us. Let us build substance in our relationship so as to make it indeed vigorous and robust, as my esteemed colleague said in Jakarta, so that it is robust enough to withstand the occasional shocks or bumps on the road that we shall travel and that we shall have to travel together as two nations destined by geography to be next-door neighbors. But as a rider to that, let me simply say that the way we manage and nurture our relationship is perhaps just as important as the substance on which that relationship is built. I think that there is large scope for us to enlarge, to give substance to that relationship. in bilateral relations, especially in the economic and commercial fields, but also in other fields. There is large scope to continue our good cooperation in facing the challenges and opportunities of the world around us. And therefore, I am so encouraged by, for example, the latest joint effort on which we have agreed upon, which is to have the Timor Gap Zone of Cooperation Agreement. Why? Not because of the prospect of material gain that we both may expect, not so much, although it may be quite substantial, but because I think that is the typical way how we should go about nurturing our relationship. We have a problem there. We could not agree on how to draw the boundary, the seabed boundary. We had, I think, 9 meetings. It was a potentially difficult problem between us. Yet we decided, and we could agree, to, instead of prolonging this division, to overcome it by having a zone of cooperation without prejudice to each other's rights, without prejudice to continuing negotiations. So I think that is a good way to solve problems among neighbors and among good friends. And that, I think, is the thought on which I would like to end my talk today. I may have been quite candid in some of my remarks, but I hope that you accept those remarks in the spirit in which it was given, in the light of what I believe to be a truth, namely that it is candor and honesty that are the attributes of real friendship. Indonesia and Australia are neighbors. Let us become good and close neighbors. There's again an Indonesian saying, it's better to have a good neighbor than a distant relative. You never know what a distant relative will ask of you. But a good neighbor is much better. Sometimes we get aid from that good neighbor. And let us also be good friends and build together a productive and mutually beneficial partnership in this part of the world and at this stage of world economic development. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alatas. I'm not sure what the good neighbours are going to ask of you either, but let's find out during our question time. As usual, I ask the questioners to state their name and their organisation. The first question's from Margot O'Neill.
Minister Margot O'Neill, ABC TV. I wanted to ask you a question on Papua New Guinea. I was wondering whether or not, in your government's view, the Papua New Guinea government is doing enough to contain the OPM rebels on the Irian-Jaya border, and whether or not what your government's policy is about hot pursuits across the border, whether or not you think Indonesia has a right to go in hot pursuit across the border in chase of those rebels.
Thank you. As you know, we have recently signed a treaty of amity, of friendship and cooperation, and we have before that signed a border arrangement treaty, which shows that actually as far as border arrangements are concerned and the wider framework of friendship and amity are concerned between Indonesia and the PNG, they have now been put on a very solid basis. We assume, like in any treaty, on both sides certain obligations with regard to the implementation of that treaty. One of them being not to use our territories in such a way as to form a nuisance or a threat. I'm using very common words, not the treaty words, towards one another. That's a very common clause in any treaty. Now, as to your specific question, I think based on our experience so far, the PNG government has tried very hard to do just that, but is sometimes unable, physically sometimes, to always and in time prevent the so-called OPM elements to make use of the border of the border area to cause trouble not only to us but to them also. So it's a problem that we are both addressing now in a much more efficient fashion as we grow in experience in dealing with this problem, as we grow in understanding one another. For example, now we don't go anymore through the cumbersome diplomatic notes and so on. We call each other immediately on the phone. We fly down to a region when there is a cause for one or the other party for concern that something is happening. And this is now the standard way of dealing with this problem. So I am quite encouraged that we will continue to be more effective in this, and that as a source of possible friction, this question will gradually be removed from Indonesian-PNG relations.
Paul Grigson.
Good afternoon, sir. Paul Grigson from the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm interested in your thoughts on the Australian media's coverage of Indonesia. And I was wondering if you could tell me, does Indonesia view the persistently negative coverage that you cited during your speech as a deliberate action based on anti-Indonesian bias? And could you also tell me under what circumstances and terms, if any, more Australian correspondents would be allowed into Jakarta permanently?
Thank you very much for your question. I was careful to stress that I was talking about only certain segments of the press, sometimes even only certain personalities of the press. You asked me whether it is deliberate. I have expected that question, and that's why I answered it already in my speech. As I don't know. I don't know. I hope it is not. There is a persistency, of course, in some cases. There is a persistent pattern in some cases. Sometimes we can trace it not to the media itself, because the media is only reporting things, but the source lies elsewhere in statements and in press releases or in position taken by certain NGOs or certain people who call themselves a quote, a national liberation movement, and things like that. So I don't know, but I think that it is enough of a phenomenon that is different and that cannot only be ascribed to this cultural gap. That was my point in my talk, and therefore important enough for both of us to get down to its roots and find out together how do we cope with this, because clearly it's not in your interest or in ours that this continues. Are there misunderstandings? Are there biases that we have together to remove and things like that?
Paul Bongiorno.
Paul Bongiorno from the 10 Network, Mr. Alatas. What is Indonesia's attitude towards Prime Minister Hawke's concept of an OECD-style organisation in the region? Do you believe it's worthwhile and, more to the point, achievable? I wonder if the chairman would allow me a little bit of latitude to ask another question. in view of the large Muslim population in Indonesia, what is your attitude to the Ayatollah Khomeini's call for the assassination of British subject Salman Rushdie?
That's having two questions in one, in one stroke. Well, on the first question, one of the tasks ahead in coming to Canberra was precisely in the opportunity that I was so gratifyingly given to me to call on His Excellency the Prime Minister to find out more about the ideas of the Prime Minister on this need for more programmatic, intensive consultations among some countries of this part of the world. Because we do want to know more about this idea. It's an interesting idea. We want to look at it very carefully. But as of this moment, that is the stage where we in Indonesia are, and also where I guess the other ASEAN members are. Certainly, it is based on a valid analysis of the situation in the world economy. And that is all that I can say as of this moment. I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister that on the occasion of the meeting, he did give me these additional information for me to convey to President Suharto, because it was on the basis of a letter to my president that time. As to the second question, Indonesia is Indonesia, and I don't like comparisons with other countries. We have, I think, done what a Muslim nation ought to do when this question of the controversial book, The Satanic Verses, came up. Our president immediately ordered our highest Islamic council, or ulamas, to look through the book and to give him his their considered view and advice as to its contents. After which I think the president will take a decision on the banning of the book. In the meantime, from various layers of Indonesia's society, which is, as you know, the largest Muslim community in the world, there have been calls, strong calls for its banning. Well, it's theoretical. That book has not even entered Indonesia yet anyway. But that is how Indonesia proceeds. And that is where I am going to stop my remarks and not give my comments on how other nations proceed to react to that incident, if I may.
Ken Davidson.
Mr. Alatas, Ken Davidson, The Age newspaper in Melbourne. You seem puzzled about the attitudes of the Australian press, whether there is some inherent bias or not. Perhaps I could help on that, in the interest of a robust discussion, take that just a little bit further, and I want to refer to East Timor and West Irian. There is a feeling in this country that in the case of West Irian, at the heart of the border problems there is your transmigration program, which is displacing the indigenous Melanesian population. The question which arises out of that is the slowdown in the transmigration program now something that's temporary just for financial reasons, or is it permanent? The second question relates to East Timor. As I'm sure you're aware, in that war there were 6 Australian non-combatant journalists killed. 5 were killed, I think it's fair to say, in cold blood. There has never been any official apology, as far as I'm aware, from the Indonesian government at that outrage. I am offering you that opportunity now. Thank you.
Thank you. The first question on Irian Jaya and transmigration. Now, this is a good example of how I view normal criticism, understandable questions, and the next stage, which I posed that question to you, persistent criticism. Now, let's take the question of transmigration. The news or the notion was spread, I don't know exactly by whom, that Indonesia's transmigration, especially in Irian Jaya, displaces indigenous groups, negatively affects the local indigenous culture, etc. We were understandably very concerned because that was totally untrue. We then asked several of very important groups, environmentalists, the World Bank, to go and see for themselves and make a response. Because if only we were to respond, people would say, oh, that's Indonesian propaganda. Because the facts are that of all the transmigration, the number of people involved in Irian Jaya and the level of arable land used in Irian Jaya are givens. They are part of statistics. And from there you can draw the conclusion yourself. Secondly, not only in Irian Jaya, but in all other parts where transmigration, a vital part for the survival of our nation, is being implemented, it is always being implemented by having people come, but the local people joining that transmigration. In other words, their economy becomes higher. They become part of a concerted economic effort to bring regional development. It is not an effort to push them away. On the contrary, to make them together grow higher. These conclusions were widely disseminated. They are just as accessible as the earlier negative reports. Now, what do? We watch which newspapers take, apart from the earlier report, the second report with the same fairness, with the same size as the first. If they do that, then we say they are fair, because first they criticized us, but then they were fair enough to give us an opportunity to get the other side of the story in. But there are a number of newspapers who simply refuse to give the same space to that second news story or report. And we know who they are. As to your second question, I think that I should preface my remarks by saying that a number of very tragic things happened in East Timor. Thousands died unnecessarily. Thousands suffered unnecessarily. And among the dead, there was the tragic death of 6 Australians. I share in the grief, especially of the families of the 6. But what was the situation in which they died? It was a civil war in East Timor. It was a very turbulent period, wasn't it? There was fighting going on among East Timorese. You are understandably concerned and maybe a little bit hurt about the death of the 6. I know that. If there is one government official which has been following the whole East Timor thing from the beginning till the end up till now, it's perhaps me. I know what happened there. I know what happened in the other international forums. I've read everything there is to read about East Timor. But what is a source of great wonderment to me up till today is that apart from the grief, understandable, apart from the feelings of perhaps rancune, understandable, about the death of the sick, all the accusations are directed towards Indonesia. Why? They went in after first talking about to the Fritilin in Delhi, and the Fritilin assuring them, we have the situation under control. Well, you know that is nonsense. It turned out to be nonsense. They were there, while there was an Australian consul there who should know better about the situation. Why, in all these years, has there never been an accusation directed to the Fritilin about these 6 deaths? Why only Indonesia? And even today, sir, you gave me, in a very generous way, the opportunity to apologize. I don't think an apology is necessary. An explanation, yes. And a reiteration of our shared grief, yes. But not an apology. I'm sorry, I have to disappoint you here. Yes.
Bruce Jones.
Bruce Jones from the Sun Herald, Mr. Alatas. I wonder if I could ask a related question to that asked earlier by Miss O'Neill. Is your government concerned about the recent army riot in Port Moresby and the implications about the discipline and morale problems in that for the Papua New Guinea Defence Forces to properly police the border with Irian Jaya? And I wonder if I could also ask you whether or not the Indonesian government believes that Indonesia has an interest in having Christmas Island as part of its territory.
On the first question, I think I can be very short. Of course, like any other country, we are following with great interest and the developments in a neighboring country. But it is not in our way to comment on developments in a friendly country which are primarily belonging to the sphere of the internal affairs of other countries. So I would not do so today also. As to Christmas Island, I would have imagined that by now you would know enough of Indonesia. It consists of 13,700 islands. Some of our naval people have even said that it is now 17,000 islands. It is the largest archipelago. 3,000 islands are inhabited. It has 170 million people and a commensurate number of problems. So I would have thought that the last thing we would want is another piece of real estate somewhere in the Indian Ocean and another problem.
Craig Skeen.
Craig Skeen from Australian Associated Press. You referred earlier to the need for tolerance in the way Australia views Indonesia. Would you agree that in some ways past intolerance by Indonesian governments and the Indonesian military to internal dissidents has coloured Australian perceptions on the issue? And as a follow-up question to the earlier one in relation to Timor, what evidence do you have that in fact Fetland were responsible for the killing of those journalists? What evidence do you have that Fetland was responsible for the killing of those journalists?
As to your first question, I don't know whether I really understood fully the question. That is, could it not be that in the way the Indonesian government treats its dissidents, that is causing Australia's anger or intolerance towards us?
general question of tolerance.
Yes, on the general question of tolerance. I see. Since when is Australia responsible for what happens in another country? Well, anyway, that's a rhetorical question. But to the substance of the question, we don't. Have you ever seen in an Indonesian newspaper persistent articles criticizing you, putting up a campaign of intolerant criticism on how you treat some of your minorities? I would ask you to go to our to our National Library and go over many years of press clippings. You'll never find any, or hardly a few. Why? Because for us, if we have relations with a friendly country, we respect each other's sovereignty, each other's ways of doing things, and we don't think it is proper for us to become champions or bring ourselves up to become champions of another minority group or another group in somebody else's country. Yet, you question whether that could be an important cause for Australia's attitude to Indonesia. I wonder whether I understood you correctly, because if that is true, it would be very regrettable indeed. But even in the substance, sir, how do you know how we treat our dissidents, or even our prisoners, or detainees? And how do you measure its comparison with what happens in other countries, including Australia? It's very difficult. We have a different system. We have a different culture. We have a different way of treating political controversy and things like that. And I'm not saying that Indonesia is a perfect country, a model country, but neither do I accept anyone saying that Indonesia is the worst possible country. I think under our Pancasila, there is a great deal of tolerance among religions, among political dissidents, among different political parties. There is great tolerance, ethnic tolerance, racial tolerance, religious tolerance. It's not so bad, you know. Indonesia is not so bad. I hope you get the opportunity one day to come there and see for yourself. The second question was about whether I had evidence that it was the Fretilin. I did not say it was the Fretilin who did it. Nobody knows up till now what really happened there. That's my point. It's a civil war. How many newsmen were lost in Vietnam and in Cambodia? What do? Mount a campaign up till now? When correspondents go into a war zone, they know that there is danger. What I'm saying is that we didn't know that they were there. We were not even involved at that time yet. They were there because the Fretilin was at that time in their heyday of political terror and intimidation against the other parties. It was at the time of the Civil War, after the Portuguese left in a shameful way the whole territory. And there was civil war, there was nothing, a breakdown of authority. The journalists went in. They should know better than listening to the assurances of Fretilin. And my additional point was, wasn't there an Australian consul there? He should have known better. Then why turn to us? Or why turn to us only and say, you are the culprit? This is what we don't accept. This is what we don't accept, and I think it's not fair. It is a great tragedy. I immediately conceded it should never have happened, just as the many thousands of Timorese who have died should never have happened. If only the Portuguese decolonized that territory exactly according to their own promises, instead of giving weapons and inciting only one little group of their own creation, which is the Fretilin. That's what they did. So, who is to blame? Is Indonesia the only black devil? And Portugal is lily white? Fretilin is lily white? Well, I'm sorry. It is this unbalance that I cannot accept.
I just remind you that we've got 4 questions left and time's running short. Could we keep them brief? Gentleman from Radio Australia.
Noim Hayat, Radio Australia Indonesian section, Melbourne. Minister, the last time an Indonesian minister graced the National Press Club, he was, upon his arrival, met by a very robust demonstration. Are you disappointed that you were not afforded the same treatment? Or could that perhaps reflect the situation in Australia as a whole? My question, actually, you've spoken about fundamental and basic differences between Indonesia and Australia. It has been said that Indonesia is a feeling culture, whereas Australia is a thinking culture. There lies the difference, and we all know what Julius Caesar, I think Shakespeare says in Julius Caesar, I think when he says, Cassius, lean and hungry looking, he thinks too much, and such men are dangerous. Thank you.
No, I'm not disappointed that there was no welcoming committee this time, and I don't know why. I don't know. I really would not want to speculate. Yes, there are differences between our 2 cultures, with feeling perhaps predominant in the one and rationality perhaps predominant in the other. But God forbid that one is only rational and one is only feeling. I hope it's a good and balanced combination of both, I think. But I came here to find out more about it and to find out practical ways how we can together overcome this, because I, for one, am convinced that we have no alternative but to be good and close neighbors, but to be good and reliable friends to one another. And if that is the conviction, then we better do something about this, something that hurts us both and something that is not in the interest of any one of us.
New China News Agency.
Xu Yanai from New China News Agency. Mr. Foreign Minister, if I remember correctly, that during Chinese Premier Li Peng's visit to Australia last November, he said in this very place that if China is ready to normalize the relations with Indonesia, and if Indonesia or China will choose the day for tomorrow. So now my question is, what can we expect and what will come up in the relations between the 2 countries following this Tokyo understanding between Suharto and the Chinese Foreign Minister Chen Jicheng? And could you please give us some more idea to the understanding? Thank you.
Well, very, very briefly, in March 1988 of this last year, our president, in his statement of account to the People's Congress, to the People's Consultative Assembly in Indonesia, about his governing policies over the past 5 years, had one paragraph on Indonesia-Chinese normalization of relations, in which he spelled out very clearly what Indonesia expected to happen on the part of China before normalization could proceed. And the only quote-unquote condition, it was not meant as a condition, it was an expectation. The only thing that was brought out was non-interference in each other's internal affairs, both between governments as well as between peoples or parties, which we thought was an eminently fair condition, if you want to call it condition, accepted in the non-aligned, in the Dasa Sila or the 10 Principles of Bandung, in the non-aligned movement, in the General Principles of the UN, etc. After that, there were various responses by leaders, by Chinese leaders, gratifying responses. Among them, the Prime Minister, on his visit here to Australia, made some remarks which we duly noted, in which could be seen as a response to that statement by the Indonesian president. That moved the process towards normalization further and further. But what happened in Tokyo, of course, was that for the first time, there was an occasion where a very high-ranking Chinese official, namely the foreign minister, when calling on President Suharto, could convey the Chinese position in unambiguous and direct fashion to President Suharto. And as such, it's a step forward. It's a very important step forward. And on that basis, I think now the process of normalization will proceed, and the technical details only need now to be further worked out. And on that too, that has already been decided. It will be done through the Indonesian and Chinese foreign ministers and the Indonesian and Chinese permanent missions in New York. So that is the situation as it is now.
Roy Eccleston.
Roy Eccleston from the Australian, Mr. Alatas. You said at the end of your speech that you thought the attributes of a good friendship were candour and honesty. In 1986, the Sydney Morning Herald published an article based on what it claimed to be facts about President Suharto's business interests. Further to that, there was also, according to the author of the story, similar talk of that nature in Jakarta at the time. Your government responded by banning Australian journalists and ministerial visits from Indonesia to Australia. Wasn't the article candid and honest, if offensive? Why did your government respond on a governmental basis against the Australian government? And why didn't your government respond against the United States when several months later the Asian Wall Street Journal published far more detailed articles on that very question?
Thank you. Well, Roy, we had a discussion on this before. And yes, we ought to be candid and frank to one another. Although you can be candid and frank in a nice way, and you can be candid and frank in an abusive way, but that is neither here nor there. A few, again, misperceptions. We have never accepted the accuracy of that report. Furthermore, that report went further than any other report. It linked the whole thing with a very biased slant and a rather vicious slant to what was happening elsewhere in the region. I hope you are honest enough to concede that is at least one glaring difference between all other similar articles that we also don't accept, at least that. And thirdly, it's not true that we have not reacted to the other articles in the Wall Street Journal and so on. But I cannot reveal to you, because it's not your business how we deal with American press. I need not give an account to you, but that's not true. We took what we believed were measures commensurate with what we believe were the seriousness of the nature of the incident. And we did it in the belief that that is the only way in which we could respond. You may not like it, as we don't like the article, but that's how life is.
My second question is, why did you respond on a governmental level to stop Indonesian ministers coming to Australia? The Australian press is different to the...
We never stopped Indonesian ministers to go to Australia. There was never a formal ban of any sort. Never. Can you show me a formal ban saying Indonesian ministers from now on are forbidden to go to Australia? No. The ministers who cancelled their visits were just as furious. Were just as if somebody maybe wrote something about you and you get furious and you react in that way, I think that's human. They were just simply outraged at that. So they decided not to go. But now I'm here with you. I'm not under any ban. And I'm even answering questions like this.
Final questions from Stuart Heather.
Minister Stuart Heather, representing both ABC Radio and Radio Australia News and Current Affairs. Can I refer you in part to this whole media question which has taken up so much of our attention, but also refer you to that part of your speech where you talked about habitually anti-Indonesian attitudes from some non-government organisations. Are you referring to other organisations than the East Timor independence movement? And if so, could you be specific about which ones? But more importantly, what mechanisms do you see are necessary to overcome the differences on media reporting and on these non-government organisations?
Well, there are a few non-governmental organizations active on East Timor, I think, not only the East Timor Independence Committee. I don't know which one, maybe ACFOA is one. Anyway, I usually have a report with me this thick, which my diligent staff from time to time updates, which government or non-governmental organizations or which media have recently put up an outrageous story about East Timor. But I simply wanted to say that sometimes it's not the media at fault, in the sense that they make the story, but it is sometimes the view of a non-governmental organization which is known to have a very biased view about a certain issue, who have, in other words, sometimes it's a so-called human rights organization with political access to grind. And as such, I think their credibility is affected. How do we go about it? Well, I don't know exactly, but certainly on East Timor, I would have thought that we have by now reached a stage that enough has been talked about, written about, explained about this issue. And enough light has been shed on it now as to be able for both of us to put it into the right proportion. Into the right proportion. You may continue to have a different view from us. We accept that. As I said in the closed meeting, I don't want you to break out in jubilation about Indonesia every time. We would be very suspicious when you did. But fairness, facts, why not? Keep it balanced and keep it in proportion. Should it overshadow everything else in our rich tapestry of relationship now and in the future? Is that your choice? Well, if it is your choice, if it is the choice of the majority of the Australian people and the government, then of course you can't do it. But I have a feeling it is not. It's only a small minority. It's only a few people, a few media sections, a few NGOs. So can't we resolve the problem together? Is it that big a problem? In Indonesian, we once had a film, Tiada maaf bagimu. Never any, what is it? Forgiveness to you. Is that big? I'm sorry, I may not have fulfilled, may not have answered your question, but that is the way how we feel. We respect your way of your way of thinking, your point of view. We accept fair criticism based on facts, because we can proceed from the same facts and still have different conclusions, right? Fair enough. Fair enough. If you think that we were wrong in certain policies, fair enough. But based on facts, not based on misrepresentation, not based on deliberate disinformation. That we cannot accept. At least let us proceed from the same facts and then differ. And differ even violently, I don't care. Not violently to get to war, right? Yes, please.
That's the end. That's the last question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Alatas, I'll be candid and honest in a nice way, and thank you for your very generous time here today. And I know you have to rush off to other appointments. It remains just for me to give you a small token to remember this visit here today. And I wish you and your wife well on the remainder of your visit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Mr.